Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, and this is the the second lecture of our three-lecture discussion during this time. And we're going to be talking once again about war, trade, and empire. Last time we ended with the battles up until 1702, and the problem with what happened when we left behind, when we lose three members of royalty, William III, James II, and Carlos II. So now we're going to be talking about what happened afterwards. Now, the War of the Spanish Succession, which is our next war, that ran from 1702 to 1714, would decide the thrones of Spain and Britain and settle the balance of power in Europe and North America for a generation. Now, the principal combatants in this war were France, Castilian Spain, loyal to the Bourbon candidate, Philip or Felipe V, and Bavaria on one side, and Britain, the Dutch Republic, Catalonian Spain, royal to an Austrian Habsburg candidate Carlos III, and most of the Holy Roman Empire, including Austria, Prussia, and Hanover. Portugal and Savoy on the other side. So again, France and part of Spain and Bavaria on one side, and Britain, the Dutch Republic, part of Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Portugal, and Savoy. Now at first, the Grand Alliance, intimidated by Louis's reputation, moved very cautiously. The stalemate was broken in the summer of 1704 when the Duke of Marlborough marched south from Flanders, met up with Prince Eugene of Savoy's army marching north from Italy, and defeated a superior French and Bavarian army under Marshal de Tallard at the Battle of Blenheim, or Blindheim, what the French called the Battle of Hochstadt, or on the Danube. Now, Blenheim was one of the decisive battles of history. First, it saved Vienna, thus preserving the Grand Alliance. Second, it knocked Bavaria out of the war. Third, it destroyed the flower of the French army. Four, it destroyed the myth of Louis XIV's invincibility. And finally, it justified in the Allied eyes an aggressive land campaign and the taxation to support it. Now, that support made possible a series of crushing victories over the French by Marlborough. At Ramillies in 1706, Oudenarde in 1708, Malplaquet in 1709, and Bouchain in 1710. Now, Louis did better in the Spanish theater of war, where Felipe's Castilian, Spanish, and French forces smashed Allied armies at Almanza in 1707, and Brihuega in 1710. Now, the first Treaty of Utrecht of 1713 and the Treaty of Rastatt, negotiated by the Holy Roman Empire in 1714, confirmed and completed the revolution of 1688 and 89, ensuring British superiority in Europe and beyond for a generation. Now, the Duke of Anjou remained on the throne of Spain as Felipe V, albeit with the promise that the crowns of Spain and France would never be worn by the same person. And the Allies received territory. The Dutch received a series of barrier forts on their southern border. The Holy Roman Emperor received territory in Italy and the Spanish Netherlands, roughly modern-day Belgium. Savoy claimed Sicily. And Britain received some territory and other concessions. They got Gibraltar and Minorca in the Mediterranean, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and Hudson's Bay in Canada, and St. Kitts in the Caribbean. And the asiento, that is the right to sell slaves, to the Spanish New World. And they also recognized the Hanoverian succession by Louis XIV. Now, though controversial at the time, the Treaty of Utrecht was a masterstroke of diplomacy. In fact, it did not matter who sat on the throne of Spain, because both Spain and France were exhausted, financially and militarily, after so many years of warfare. Now, Britain's territorial acquisitions would make it the wealthiest trade nation on earth. Now, Louis never fully understood that he was beaten not by better generalship, though that certainly helped, but by the longest purse. Now, a story related by Samuel Johnson in his Lives of the Poets about the efforts of French diplomats to overawe the English diplomat and poet Matthew Prior at Versailles, sent to negotiate a partition treaty after the 9 Years' War, sums up the contrasting attitudes and experience of the British and the French. From the 17th to the mid-18th century, supremacy in trade passed from country to country. The Spanish lost the ability to capitalize on the New World wealth. The Dutch dominated the mid-17th century, building a relatively open and tolerant society and producing a great culture, and soon afterwards they went into decline as a result of successive wars against first Britain, then France. Now the French did well in the third quarter of the 17th century, but were hurt by exodus of Huguenot merchants after 1685. So by 1680, the British were experiencing a commercial revolution based on American tobacco, sugar, and slaves, and East Indian silk, spices, and medicines. Still, when Britain went to war against France, it was militarily and economically inferior to France. The 9 Years' War was the most expensive in English history to date, trebling total government expenditure to about £5.5 million a year. Louis seemed to be able to raise these funds easily because he had no parliament with which to deal. Rather, he simply taxed the French peasantry at will. William did have to deal with Parliament, which only reluctantly voted him a land tax in 1693, but it was not enough to fund the war. Fortunately, William had an able Chancellor of the Exchequer named Charles Montagu, later Earl and Marquis of Halifax. His idea was to tap England's growing commercial wealth by soliciting loans from merchants. Now, this would have been a hard sell. Charles II had gone bankrupt in 1762, and the government's credit was terrible. The fact that William's regime was a revolutionary one, seemingly teetering on the brink, made potential lenders even more reluctant. Now, Montagu offered government annuities, paying 14% interest, 14% interest that became fabulously popular. Sorry about that. And Montagu also established government-sponsored lotteries. In 1694, Montagu sponsored the Bank of England, which also lent money to the government in exchange for its charter. It acted as a private bank, making loans and receiving deposits. It was an investment opportunity for subscribers, and it became a sort of federal reserve to regulate the money supply. The result was a financial revolution with far-reaching effects. In the short term, the British government raised fabulous sums of money. It enabled the Crown to raise and supply its armies in Europe, the Royal Navy at sea, and its allies with subsidies. In the long run, this wealth made England the greatest military power on earth. Now, in order to secure parliamentary approval for the financial revolution, William had to call Parliament regularly, thus solidifying constitutional monarchy. The socioeconomic importance of the financial revolution was that it created a new class of wealthy investors, or moneyed men, who made their fortune out of credit, not land or goods. Now, as anyone could rise, this ability further weakened the great chain of being. Now, as a result of these new commercial and financial arrangements and the territories acquired at Utrecht, Britain became the wealthiest and most powerful nation in Europe. British trade was led by the import to British territories and re-export to Europe of Caribbean sugar, followed by American tobacco, furs, and saltfish, Indian silks, dyes, and spices, Portuguese Madeira and port wine, Spanish oranges, figs, and raisins, Italian olive oils and silks, and Middle Eastern coffee, which gave rise to coffee house culture in London. Now, all these trades were protected by the Navigation Act and safeguarded by the Royal Navy. Now, underpinning it all was the slave trade and the murderous exploitation of Africans in the New World. British slavers shipped metal goods and textiles to Africa. There they traded with African chiefs for captives. These people were transported to the New World in appalling conditions at a rate of 5,000 a year. And once sold to a West Indian sugar grower or American tobacco grower, the African captives were treated like human machinery. The average life expectancy of the slaves was 7 years. The tobacco or sugar harvested by the slaves was sent to East Coast American ports for refining. Then the tobacco and sugar was shipped to London, Bristol, Liverpool, Glasgow, or other ports. From there, these products were sent into the interior or onto Europe at a considerable markup. Thus, a good deal of British and American prosperity in the 18th century was built on the backs of captive Africans, or at the expense of Native Americans driven from their land. Now, British trade yielded vast sums of money, which yielded military superiority, which in turn yielded victories, colonies, and further trade. Now, eventually, the profits from this process would be invested in more successful wars against France. The profits would also be poured into the First Industrial Revolution, thus further extending the British economic lead. And thus, while defeating absolutism and forging modern notions of human rights and democracy, the British were also denying the humanity of millions. Now, gradually forced to confront the contradiction, they were the first to have real qualms about the slave trade, finally outlawing it in 1807. Now, despite the massive human misery treated by the Atlantic system, the ultimate legacy of the Glorious Revolution and of the Treaty of Utrecht was arguably to lay much of the foundation of much that is good in Western civilization.